welcome to Necessary Chaos, and today I want to talk about a zombie apocalypse. Alright? Is a zombie apocalypse possible? Well, yes and no. Horror movie wise, a zombie apocalypse isn't really probable because of the fact that it's pretty impossible for somebody to die and come back from being dead. Actually die and come back from being dead. Now, you could basically say, okay, they're in a state of comatose and their life signs are so weak you can't tell they're dead. That's a gray area. That's possible. But for someone to actually be dead, come back from the dead, and be a walking corpse, that's pretty much impossible. For the most part, I think most people can agree that's really out there in the realm of stretching things. And on top of that, it's basically a lot of these zombie movies, you have them rising up from their graves and half rotted already when they're coming back to life. And the anatomy of that's kind of not probable as well, because if you know anything about ligaments and tendons and muscles and bones and all that, you need all of this stuff to even just stand properly. You lose your Achilles tendon, if that rotted out or whatever, you're not exactly very mobile. So to do it horror movie style where you die and come back from the dead or rise from the graves or whatever, that's probably never going to happen. However, to do it Black Plague style, because if you read any of the articles about the Black Plague, we have documentation. No, we don't have videotapes. There wasn't really a medical system back there at the time. Well, not one you would actually want to go and take part of. Leeching and demons and bad spirits in your body. That was basically the medical practices back in the day. But a lot of religious people, priests and monks and the religious aspect, the churches, they sometimes kept documentation of what they were seeing as far as the plague. And I'm not going to get very much into the plague, but the symptoms of the plague, it would kill you in 5 to 7 days, the Black Plague. And it would basically cause things to happen like your internal organs and your brain would basically liquefy over that 5 to 7 days. And if you can understand that, once your brain would start to liquefy, you really aren't with it. So you would stagger around, you would slur your speech, you wouldn't understand what's going on, you couldn't feel pain, various other things. You would have liquid oozing from your ears, your eyes, your nose, your mouth. All of your orifices would be oozing things. In some cases, your intestines would be hanging out of parts of your body and things of that nature. And it was disgusting and gory and generally something that you do see in horror movies. And my theory is that a lot of what they based zombie movies on was based on the stories that the religious individuals wrote about what they saw during the Black Plague, and we still have to this day, because churches are very good with holding their records for the most part. So, is that possible? Yes, it's very possible for there to be a new version of a virus like the Black Plague. But could it affect the whole world? How could that happen? How would something of that magnitude occur? Well, let's break it down like this, okay? You have one man, alright? We have a doctor. We will call him Dr. Bob. So this is Dr. Bob. Now, somewhere in the world, there is a viral outbreak, bacterial outbreak. Basically, there's an outbreak, and it is an epidemic. It causes an epidemic in the region it is in. It is a virus that is highly contagious. It can be caught in multiple different ways, but if you come within the vicinity of someone, it's got, let's say, a 60% or higher contraction rate. So if you come into contact with someone with it, you go into an area where people have this, you're more likely than not to get it. And we are going to say that it has a very fast gestation period, which means within 12 to 24 hours you are going to start exhibiting symptoms of it, and by 48 hours you will be in full-flown sickness mode from this disease. And this disease well, not disease, virus, will kill you in, a matter of days if you don't get proper treatment, and etc., etc. So this happens. There's an epidemic. Bob and a bunch of other people and the CDC. CDC is very important for all of this. And the CDC is a very important organization anyway. They are the Center of Disease Control. And they are very important because if we did not have the CDC, many people would probably have already died from certain diseases, because they're the ones that say, oh, there's an outbreak of this in a certain area, we need to lock down the airports, we need to lock down ships, we need to make sure the people in this area do not come or go from this area, we need to keep track of who has come and gone from this area to contain whatever disease or virus or bacterial infections or whatever is going on can be contained. So they're very crucial, especially nowadays. Sometimes you hear people talk about things like dirty bombs and things like that. If one of those ever went off and it had a highly contagious virus associated with it or something like that, the CDC would be the people in charge of making sure that the contamination area and the effects of this stay to a smallest radius as possible, and infect and afflict as few people as possible. So anyway, Bob goes over here as per the CDC and various things. They're getting volunteers, they're getting doctors. Well, Bob is a leading expert in his field of medicine, and he is an expert at viruses and identifying viruses, and etc., etc. So Dr. Bob, he says, yes, I'll come out there, I'll come to this faraway land, and I will help in any way I can. So Bob goes out there and he helps assess the people, he helps treat these people so that they can have a better chance of survival, and he helps other researchers, and they research and they find a vaccine. So they give the people the vaccine, and of course the people treating and helping also take the vaccine, because they can't run the risk of returning home with this disease, illness, virus, and so that's how that goes. They all get the vaccine. So now a day or two goes by, and Bob's fine, everybody's fine, and the vaccine's working, it's doing what it's supposed to do. Bob packs up his things and heads home. Takes Bob about another day. So this is 3 days since the vaccine, and Bob is now back in the city that he needs to be in to catch a flight, his first flight. It will take Bob 2 flights to get back to his home country. But the morning of his flight, Bob now has the symptoms of a minor cold. But Bob's a doctor. Bob is a viral expert. So he checks himself just in case, he checks his temp, checks this, checks everything he can possibly check, and he is very convinced he only has a very minor cold, which from all the traveling and things like that, it's not so improbable that he couldn't have a minor cold. He's quite convinced, he's quite certain that's all that's going on. So Bob goes to the crowded airport through the large city, and he catches his flight. He's on an almost packed flight with people from areas nearby and people from also faraway lands just like Bob. So he flies to the next airport. At this time, Bob is still only mild cold symptoms, and Bob knows a cold can take a few days to get through his system. But Bob is also a doctor and an expert in the viral area, so he's keeping a close eye on his symptoms to make sure they don't get worse, because he realizes he was just in a highly, contaminable situation. But he's more than convinced everything's fine and dandy. So now he's at his second destination. He stays there a night, goes to another crowded airport, hops another flight from another country, full of people from countries around the area, and he returns home. Now at this point, it's been about 5 days of traveling for Bob. He now arrives home. He is welcomed at his third airport by his family and friends. He goes home. He's at home for a couple of days, and then he gets a phone call from a prestigious university. Sorry, can't talk today. So they ask Bob, would you like to come and give a lecture? Would you like to speak to some of the students at the university about your adventure you just had with this viral outbreak. And Bob is more than happy to do so. So now Bob goes back to the same airport. He hops on another crowded plane and flies to this university on the other side of his country. To about a couple hundred university students, Bob gives a lecture. And then Bob goes back to the airport, flies home, arrives at that airport, goes home, and basically enjoys his time. And for the most part, that ends our story with Bob. Now, the university, however, this lecture took place a week before spring break. So now, all the people that were in the lecture hall, they are either returning home. Some of them will stay at the university or in the area because maybe they live in the area. Maybe they live on the dorm and don't have the money to go to spring break or to return home. But many of these students will go back home, and some of them will go to spring break. Going to spring break means they will probably head to Florida or Mexico or Vegas or various other places where there are larger numbers of university students. And then after spring break, all of these university students will return to their universities or home, and they will be around a plethora of other university students. So around this time though, around the time spring break is occurring, Bob becomes very sick. Bob is no longer exhibiting mild cold symptoms. Bob is now exhibiting full-on plague symptoms, but much slower. But the first thing Bob is realizing is that his motor skills, his cognitive ability, his ability to speak and to remember and think straight are starting to suffer. Because Bob is going through something which is a new virus, and he is now starting to lose his mind. When he's losing his mind though, he's noticing minor rotting. His body is starting to actually break down. He's getting, injuries and wounds on his body that he shouldn't have. So he checks into the hospital. Hospital starts watching Bob. Bob's deteriorating at a steady pace. And let's say this disease, unlike the Black Plague that kills you in 5 to 7 days, this takes 3 months. And let's say that Bob is still contagious during this 3-month period. Therefore, anyone that Bob is coming into contact with, even now, he's infecting. But how did Bob become infected with this virus? Well, Bob didn't catch the original virus. Bob got the vaccine. But the vaccine, when it hit Bob's system, Bob had a unique biological makeup. Okay, if you want to call him a mutant, if you want to say he just had an allergic reaction, but the allergic reaction reacted in a way that it mutated the vaccine. But I don't like using the word mutated. We are going to say that the vaccine evolved. The virus in the vaccine evolved. Now, vaccines are very unique. Not any two vaccines are necessarily the same. For smallpox, they actually gave people cowpox. Cowpox is pretty harmless to people, but you will develop an immunity to smallpox by being injected with cowpox. That's how that one works. The flu vaccine has a variety of strains, and therefore each year, that's why you can't get a flu vaccine at the beginning of the year for flu season. They have to understand what type of strain the flu virus is before they give you the vaccine. And the vaccines are very complicated, and they are multi-tiered, and they are et cetera, et cetera. And not any one vaccine is the same as the other. But we got this measles outbreak right now, okay? And it's come to the point where France has made it mandatory, apparently. You don't even have the option there. Because the documents that said it caused autism and all of this were found to be fake, and apparently the doctor that wrote the article has now lost his license and all of that. And the medical establishment has gone back and looked at all the research that was, released saying it caused that and disproved all of it. So it was fake news, basically. We aren't having a problem with that now or anything, are we? But the problem is, this fake news has caused a whole lot of problems, has caused measles to be a big issue once again when it was almost gone. Now, the biggest problem with this is, you got a vaccine for measles, you might be vulnerable for measles. You may still be able to catch measles. Why is that? Because like I said before, viruses evolve. They all go from one person to another person and change. And they always like to throw on, oh, the virus mutated. It doesn't mutate, okay? It evolves. Viruses are ever changing. They evolve, they adapt, they become multiple different versions of one virus. And just like humans, just like Darwinism, just like the Galapagos Islands, a virus is going to adapt so that it can survive through this vaccine, or so it can be stronger, or so that has better contagion and all of this. So basically what's happening right now is the strain of measles that people have now is not the strain of measles necessarily that we were vaccinated for. So that means even if we were vaccinated, there is a percentage, there is a chance, there is a probability that everyone vaccinated for the original measles vaccine could still potentially contract or get this new strain of measles if it evolves in that way. And that's what they mean when they talk about superbugs. Some flus can go from one animal to another. Swine flu, avian flu, the bird flu. That's what they're referring to. Because what happens is those come from birds and pigs, but they can be contracted by humans. And they worry about things like raccoons in that as well, because there's a probability that a raccoon can catch a virus from something, but when the virus hits the raccoon, it adapts, it changes, because now it's in the raccoon's anatomy. Then that virus can be contracted by humans, and that virus then can change once more and become something very lethal. So it is definitely possible, it's definitely probable, and for the sake of this argument, Bob has done just that. Bob's anatomy was slightly different than the average person's, and he has created within himself a superbug. Now this superbug is airborne, but it only appears as a common cold. Bob went and saw another doctor to get a second opinion. They did blood work, they did everything, and they told Bob, you have a common cold. I'm going to give you some antibiotics just in case. Meanwhile, Bob is contaminating everyone, because within 24 to 48 hours, Bob was contagious. So every single airport, every single airplane, except this doesn't have a 60% contagion rate, it has an 80% or higher contagion rate, which means almost every single person Bob came near, he contaminated. Through coughing, through sneezing, whatever. And he's a doctor, so he's smart enough to cover his mouth and whatever, but you got luggage in your hands, you clear your throat. You know, but Bob infected a good majority of these people, not just from his hometown, but at least 5 different airports, different places of the world. And now Bob is almost 3 weeks from the original time he got contaminated, between 3 to 4 weeks. This thing has a gestation period of about 3 weeks, which means some countries are starting to just now see the same thing happening with people. But by the time the CDC can figure out what's going on with Bob, this is out of control already. Because within 24 to 48 hours of Bob running into the people at the airport, they have already started to contaminate people in their cities. And they have started to contaminate. So basically what we have right now is a zombie apocalypse. Within the next month, a good portion of people from around the world are going to be staggering around with half-melted, liquefied brains in unrational, uncontrolled states. And it is going to happen so quickly that the CDC isn't going to have time, especially since we don't know how many of the people of the CDC are infected. We don't know how many military are infected. We don't know how many police officers are infected. So the CDC, once they understand the full grasp of this, are most likely going to say every airport everywhere in the world is on lockdown. No ships will come in or out of harbors. No one is allowed to come in and out of towns, lock down the highways, lock down the cities. And this is what they did during the Black Plague. They sealed off towns. Food and water weren't allowed to come in and out of castle walls. Villages died because they didn't have enough food or water, because a lot of that was inside castle walls, or villages kept that tight and wouldn't let people come and go. And they would do the same thing. They would tell people to get into their house and board up and hang tight for at least a month. Because in a month's time, you would know who was infected. But your kid could be infected, and that could cause you to be infected. Your whole neighbor, you know, their entire family could be infected. You may have them trying to, you know, tear through your walls and beat down your doors with their bare hands. We don't know. what will happen once these people lose their brains, lose their minds. So it would be the closest to a zombie apocalypse, but it would be on a viral scale. And that's why the CDC is so very important. When you rationalize it like this and say it only takes one individual with a highly contagious virus to get to an airport, and that is enough to contaminate possibly multiple countries around the world. Now, would this cause an extinction level scenario for human beings? It could. Theoretically, it could. Realistically, probably not. Realistically, what would most likely happen is, let's say for whatever reason, there wasn't a single Philippines person on the airplane, at any of the airports, and no one from these regions, no one that was inflicted, traveled to the Philippines that was contagious before the lockdown. That would mean that the Filipinos in the Philippines would be safe. So the Philippines country and the people in the Philippines would survive this. And the same could be said if you are a mountain man. You live out in the isolation of the mountains and you don't come down from those mountains in that 3-month period, you are most likely not going to contract this ailment. But it would be on the scale of the European Black Plague. It would most likely wipe out a good 60% of the population because of how dense our populations are and because of how much traveling we do from place to place nowadays. You hop on a plane and you're someplace in 3-4 hours. Not only that, but we also have to remember that because of the scenario of spring break and the universities, there were a lot of people contaminated. And if Dr. Bob hadn't flown to different airports, if Dr. Bob had just been Bob the janitor, and he lived in a very small town where people don't really have a whole lot of economy, a whole lot of money and income to do traveling, it probably would have been in a much smaller scale. So there are a lot of variables that have to play. This is like a 1 in a 800 billion chance, probably. I mean, it is probably a very, very improbable scenario that one individual will contract a virus like that, and it will change in their anatomy to a point that once they hit all these different places. But we have seen this. We have seen this because we had the kid with the measles that went to Disneyland, and they saw a small outbreak because of that. And that's just the way it works. You take an individual that's contaminated and you put them in a major metropolis. Let's say Dr. Bob was a janitor, not in a small town. Let's say Dr. Bob was Janitor Bob and he contracted this virus by accident from a rat or something, but then it's Christmas time and he goes to Times Square in New York City. Or he goes to New Year's Eve in New York to watch the ball drop. He still has the potential to contaminate a large amount of people, and some of those people are from different parts of the world. People fly from other parts of the world for the ball drop in New York. So once again, it all comes down to the scenario and how the scenario plays out. And that's a big part of the CDC. The CDC are like a CSI on a bigger scale. They have to figure out what this disease is, how many people could have possibly come into contact with it, how do we contain this, how do we fix this, how do we stop this. And out of all the branches of the government, if I ever heard, well, they're going to cut funding to the CDC, the Center of Disease Control, I would shake my head, because out of all the security branches, out of all the most important branches of our government, they are most likely the most important branch that we don't really hear about. We don't really hear about them unless, oh, there was an outbreak of the plague. Well, a lot of people don't realize this. The Black Plague still exists. There are still random outbreaks of this every once in a while. Even in North America, you'll get a case or two a year of the Black Plague. And it's just nowadays we understand medicine far better than they did back then. They understand how to treat it and various things like that. But could there be a zombie apocalypse? No. But could there be a viral apocalypse? Yes. Could the virus mimic movie zombies? Definitely. The Black Plague almost identical. You read the descriptions that they wrote about the Black Plague, and if it's not a freaking zombie, I don't know what. When you read the descriptions of them and you watch a zombie movie, they talk about black skin and rotted flesh and ears oozing brain and eyes oozing liquid, and and they got, you know, just all sorts of things falling and hanging off of them, and they're incoherent, and they will run at people and attack people and try to eat people even. They'll try to bite people and claw at people because their brain is liquefied. They're not there anymore. So yeah, that's that. I do think it is probable. It is highly unlikely. It's not impossible, but could happen. It definitely could happen. And especially when you look at the fact that, you know, you're going to sit there and say, yeah, but there's no viruses like that. Well, there's no natural viruses like that. But there are places where they research viruses like this. And I would almost stake 100% that this virus does exist. I would almost swear up and down that somewhere in some lab they have created something similar to what I just discussed, and it's on lockdown. And the worst part about that is, that's once again why I say the CDC is so important, because they research these viruses, and the reason they research them is they want to have a better understanding. And in my opinion, I think it's bad. It's bad. Why are they messing with stuff? Because all it takes is a breach. Oh, here we go. It got out of the lab. Goodbye, humanity. But just like we are researching it to understand it in North America, and there are scientists constantly experimenting with viruses and evolving viruses and making new viruses and understanding how they work and adapt, there are evil people doing the exact same thing, except they have malicious intent. Their intent is to find a virus just like I said and release it on their enemies, because you could wipe out the United States with one small bomb, you know, one small, you know, a small group of people. You could even inject your own people, ship them over as refugees, you know, and then they're infecting the entire populace. And that is a very, very frightening thought. And that is why, as much as I hate the CDC and scientists researching viruses, it's actually very crucial. We have to understand what's out there and how to contain it and treat it and all of that. But I don't necessarily agree with it. Unfortunately, we got evil people doing it as well, so we kind of have a necessity for it. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Stay away from sick people, you know? You don't have to go anywhere if there's sick people, don't go. And hopefully you're not around someone that is sick and don't know they're sick and you don't know they're sick. But that's what I have to say about that. Try to stay safe, try to stay healthy, and take it easy.